Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 51, Part 2. As we passed along the familiar street at night, Mr. Peggotty, in despite of all my remonstrances, carrying my bag, I glanced into Omer and Joram's shop and saw my old friend Mr. Omer there smoking his pipe. I felt reluctant to be present when Mr. Peggotty first met his sister and Ham, and made Mr. Omer my excuse for lingering behind. "How is Mr. Omer after this long time?" said I, going in. He fanned away the smoke of his pipe that he might get a better view of me, and soon recognized me with great delight.
"I should get up, sir, to acknowledge such an honour as this visit," said he. "Only my limbs are rather out of sorts, and I am wheeled about. With the exception of my limbs and my breath, howsoever, I am as hearty as a man could be, I'm thankful to say."
I congratulated him on his contented looks and his good spirits, and saw now that his easy-chair went on wheels.
"It's an ingenious thing, ain't it?"
he inquired, following the direction of my glance, and polishing the elbow with his arm.
"It runs as light as a feather, and tracks as true as a mail coach. Bless you, my little Minnie, my granddaughter, Minnie's child, puts her little strength against the back, gives it a shove, and away we go. As clever and merry as ever you see anything. And I tell you what, it's a most uncommon chair to smoke a pipe in."
I never saw such a good old fellow to make the best of a thing, and find out the enjoyment of it as Mr. Omer. He was as radiant as if his chair, his asthma, and the failure of his limbs were the various branches of a great invention for enhancing the luxury of a pipe.
"I see more of the world, I can assure you," said Mr. Omer, "in this chair than ever I see out of it. You'd be surprised at the number of people that looks in of a day to have a chat. You really would. There's twice as much in the newspaper since I've taken to this chair as there used to be. As to general reading, dear me, what a lot of it I do get through. That's what I feel so strong, If it had been my eyes, what should I have done? If it had been my ears, what should I have done? Being my limbs, what does it signify? Why, my limbs only made my breath shorter when I used them. And now if I want to go out into the street or go down to the sands, I've only got to call Dick, Joram's young apprentice, and away I go in my carriage, like the Lord Mayor of London."
He half suffocated himself with laughing here.
"Lord bless you," said Mr. Omer, resuming his pipe. "A man must take the fat with the lean. That's what he must make up his mind to in this life. Joram does a fine business, excellent business."
"I am glad to hear it," said I.
"I knew you would be," said Mr. Omer. "And Joram and Minnie are like Valentines. What more can a man expect? What's his limbs to that?"
His supreme contempt for his own limbs as he sat smoking was one of the pleasantest oddities I have ever encountered.
"And since I've took to general reading, you've took to general writing, eh, sir?" said Mr. Omer, surveying me admiringly. "What a lovely work that was of yours! What expressions in it! I read it, every word, every word. And as to feeling sleepy, not at all.
I laughingly expressed my satisfaction, but I must confess that I thought this association of ideas significant.
I give you my word of honour, sir, said Mr. Romer, that when I lay that book upon the table and look at it outside, compact in 3 separate and individual volumes, 1, 2, 3, I am as proud as Punch to think that I once had the honour of being connected with your family. And dear me, it's a long time ago now, ain't it? Over at Blunderston, with a pretty little party laid along with the other party. And you quite a small party then yourself. Dear, dear.
I changed the subject by referring to Emily, after assuring him that I did not forget how interested he had always been in her and how kindly he had always treated her. I gave him a general account of her restoration to her uncle by the aid of Martha, which I knew would please the old man. He listened with the utmost attention and said feelingly when I had done, I am rejoiced in it, sir. It's the best news I've had for many a day. Dear, dear, dear. And what's going to be undertook for the unfortunate young woman, Martha, now? You touch a point that my thoughts have been dwelling on since yesterday, said I, but on which I can give you no information yet, Mr. Romer. Mr. Peggotty has not alluded to it, and I have a delicacy in doing so. I'm sure he's not forgotten it. He forgets nothing that is disinterested and good.
Because, you know, said Mr. Romer, taking himself up where he had left off, whatever is done, I should wish to be a member of. Put me down for anything you might consider right, and let me know. I never could think the girl all bad, and I am glad to find she's not. So will my daughter Minnie be. Young women are contradictory creatures in some things. Her mother was just the same as her, but their hearts are soft and kind. It's all show with Minnie about Martha. Why she should consider it necessary to make any show, I don't understand to tell you, but it's all show, bless you. She'd do her any kindness in private, so put me down for whatever you may consider right. Will you be so good, and drop me a line where to forward it? Dear me, said Mr. Romer, when a man is drawing on to a time of life where the two ends of life meet, when he finds himself, however hearty he is, being wheeled about for a second time in a species of go-cart, he should be over-rejoiced to do a kindness if he can. He wants plenty, and I don't speak of myself particular, said Mr. Romer, because, sir, the way I look at it is that we're all drawing on to the bottom of the hill, whatever age we are, on account of time never standing still for a single moment. So let us always do a kindness and be over-rejoiced, to be sure. He knocked the ashes out of his pipe and put it on a ledge in the back of his chair, expressly made for its reception. There's Emily's cousin, him that she was to have been married to, said Mr. Omer, rubbing his hands feebly. As fine a fellow as there is in Yarmouth. He'll come and talk or read to me in the evening, for an hour together sometimes. That's a kindness, I should call it. All his life's a kindness. I'm going to see him now, said I. Are you? Said Mr. Romer. Tell him I was hearty and sent my respects. Minnie and Joram's at a ball. They would be as proud to see you as I am if they was at home. Minnie won't hardly go out at all, you see, on account of father, she says. So I swore tonight that if she didn't go, I'd go to bed at 6. In consequence of which, Mr. Omer shook himself in his chair with laughter at the success of his device, she and Joram's at a ball. I shook hands with him and wished him good night. Half a minute, sir, said Mr. Omer. If you was to go without seeing my little elephant, you'd lose the best of sights. You'd never see such a sight. Minnie! A musical little voice answered from somewhere upstairs. I'm coming, grandfather. And a pretty little girl with long, flaxen, curling hair soon came running into the shop. This is my little elephant, sir, said Mr. Omer, fondling the child. Siamese breed, sir. Now, little elephant. The little elephant set the door of the parlour open, enabling me to see that in these latter days it was converted into a bedroom for Mr. Omer, who could not be easily conveyed upstairs, and then hid her pretty forehead and tumbled her long hair against the back of Mr. Omer's chair. The elephant butts, you know, sir, said Mr. Omer, winking, when he goes at an object. Once elephant, twice, 3 times. At this signal, the little elephant, with a dexterity that was next to marvellous in so small an animal, whisked the chair round with Mr. Omer in it and rattled it off pell-mell into the parlour without touching the doorpost. Mr. Omer indescribably enjoying the performance and looking back at me on the road as if it were the triumphant issue of his life's exertions. After a stroll about the town, I went to Ham's house. Peggotty had now removed here for good and had let her own house to the successor of Mr. Barkis in the carrying business, who had paid her very well for the goodwill, cart, and horse. I believe the very same slow horse that Mr. Barkis drove was still at work. I found them in the neat kitchen, accompanied by Mrs. Gummidge, who had been fetched from the old boat by Mr. Peggotty himself. I doubt if she could have been induced to desert her post by anyone else. He had evidently told them all. Both Peggotty and Mrs. Gummidge had their aprons to their eyes, and Ham had just stepped out to take a turn on the beach. He presently came home, very glad to see me, and I hope they were all the better for my being there. We spoke with some approach to cheerfulness of Mr. Peggotty's growing rich in a new country, and of the wonders he would describe in his letters. He said nothing of Emily by name, but distantly referred to her more than once. Ham was the serenest of the party. But Peggotty told me when she lighted me to a little chamber where the crocodile book was lying ready for me on the table, that he always was the same. She believed, she told me, crying, that he was broken-hearted, though he was as full of courage as of sweetness, and worked harder and better than any boat-builder in any yard in all that part. There were times, she said, of an evening when he talked of their old life in the boat-house, and when he mentioned Emily as a child, but he never mentioned her as a woman. I thought I had read in his face that he would like to speak to me alone. I therefore resolved to put myself in his way next evening, as he came home from his work. Having settled this with myself, I fell asleep. That night, for the first time in all those many nights, the candle
was taken out of the window. Mr. Peggotty swung in his old hammock in the old boat, and the wind murmured with the old sound round his head. All next day he was occupied in disposing of his fishing boat and tackle, in packing up and sending to London by wagon such of his little domestic possessions as he thought would be useful to him, and in parting with the rest, or bestowing them on Mrs. Gummidge. She was with him all day. As I had a sorrowful wish to see the old place once more before it was locked up, I engaged to meet them there in the evening, but I so arranged it as that I should meet Ham first. It was easy to come in his way, as I knew where he worked. I met him at a retired part of the sands, which I knew he would cross, and turned back with him that he might have leisure to speak to me if he really wished. I had not mistaken the expression on his face. We had walked but a little way together when he said, without looking at me, "Master Davy, have you seen her?" "Only for a moment, when she was in a swoon," I softly answered. We walked a little farther, and he said, "Master Davy, shall you see her, do you think?" "It would be too painful to her, perhaps," said I. "I have thought of that," he replied. "So 'twould, sir, so 'twould." "But, Ham," said I gently, "if there is anything that I could write to her for you, in case I could not tell it, if there is anything you would wish to make known to her through me, I should consider it a sacred trust." "I am sure on't. I thank ye, sir, most kind. I think there is something I could wish said or wrote." "What is it?" We walked a little farther in silence, and then he spoke. "Tant that I forgive her, tant that so much. 'Tis more as I beg of her to forgive me for having pressed my affections upon her. Odd times I think that if I hadn't had her promise for to marry me, sir, she was that trustful of me in a friendly way that she'd have told me what was struggling in her mind and would have counselled with me, and I might have saved her." I pressed his hand. "Is that all?" "There's yet something else," he returned, "if I can say it, Master Davy." We walked on farther than we had walked yet before he spoke again. He was not crying when he made the pauses I shall express by lines. He was merely collecting himself to speak very plainly. "I loved her, and I love the memory of her too deep to be able to lead her to believe of my own self as I'm a happy man. I could only be happy by forgetting of her, and I'm afeard I couldn't hardly bear as she should be told I'd done that. But if you, being so full of learning, Master Davy, could think of anything to say as might bring her to believe I wasn't greatly hurt, still loving of her and mourning for her, anything as might bring her to believe as I was not tired of my life, and yet was hoping for to see her without blame where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. Anything as would ease her sorrowful mind, and yet not make her think as I could ever marry, or as 'twas possible that anyone could ever be to me what she was. I should ask of you to say that, with my prayers for her that was so dear. I pressed his manly hand again and told him I would charge myself to do this as well as I could. "I thank ye, sir," he answered. "'Twas kind of you to meet me. 'Twas kind of you to bear him company down, Master Davy. I understand very well, though my aunt will come to London afore they sail, and they'll unite once more, that I am not like to see him again. I fare to feel sure on't. We don't say so, but so 'twill be, and better so. The last you see on him, the very last, will you give him the lovingest duty and thanks of the orphan, as he was ever more than a father too?" This I also promised faithfully. "I thank ye again, sir," he said, heartily shaking hands. "I know where you're a-going. Goodbye." With a slight wave of his hand as though to explain to me that he could not enter the old place, he turned away. As I looked after his figure crossing the waste in the moonlight, I saw him turn his face towards a strip of silvery light upon the sea and pass on looking at it until he was a shadow in the distance. The door of the boathouse stood open when I approached, and on entering I found it emptied of all its furniture, saving one of the old lockers on which Mrs. Gummidge, with a basket on her knee, was seated looking at Mr. Peggotty. He leaned his elbow on the rough chimney-piece and gazed upon a few expiring embers in the grate, but he raised his head hopefully on my coming in and spoke in a cheery manner. "Come, according to promise, to bid farewell to it, Master Davy?" he said, taking up the candle. "Bare enough now, ain't it?" "Indeed, you have made good use of the time," said I. "Why, we have not been idle, sir. Mrs. Gummidge has worked like a—" "I don't know what Mrs. Gummidge hasn't worked like," said Mr. Peggotty, looking at her at a loss for a sufficiently approving simile. Mrs. Gummidge, leaning on her basket, made no observation. "There's the very locker that you used to sit on, 'long with Emily," said Mr. Peggotty in a whisper. "I'm a-going to carry it away with me last of all. And here's your little old bedroom, see, Master Davy? Almost as bleak tonight as art could wish." In truth, the wind, though it was low, had a solemn sound, and crept around the deserted house with a whispered wailing that was very mournful. Everything was gone, down to the little mirror with the oyster-shell frame. I thought of myself lying here when that first great change was being wrought at home. I thought of the blue-eyed child who had enchanted me. I thought of Steerforth, and a foolish, fearful fancy came upon me of his being near at hand and liable to be met at any turn. "'Tis like to be long," said Mr. Peggotty in a low voice, "afore the boat finds new tenants. They look upon it down here as being unfortunate now." "Does it belong to anybody in the neighbourhood?" I asked. "To a mast maker uptown," said Mr. Peggotty. "I'm a-going to give him the key tonight." We looked into the other little room and came back to Mrs. Gummidge, sitting on the locker, whom Mr. Peggotty, putting the light on the chimney-piece, requested to rise that he might carry it outside the door before extinguishing the candle.
"Daniel,"
said Mrs. Gummidge, suddenly deserting her basket and clinging to his arm.
"My dear Daniel, the parting words I speak in this house is, I mustn't be left behind. Don't you think of leaving me behind, Daniel. Oh, don't you ever do it."
Mr. Peggotty, taken aback, looked from Mrs. Gummidge to me and from me to Mrs. Gummidge, as if he had been awakened from a sleep.
"Don't ye, dearest Daniel, don't ye?"
cried Mrs. Gummidge fervently.
"Take me along with you, Daniel. Take me along with you and Emily. I'll be your servant, constant and true. If there's slaves in them parts where you're a-going, I'll be bound to you for one and happy, but don't you leave me behind, Daniel. That's a dearie dear."
"My good soul," said Mr. Peggotty, shaking his head, "you don't know what a long voyage and what a hard life 'tis."
"Yes, I do, Daniel, I can guess," cried Mrs. Gummidge. "But my parting words under this roof, I shall go into the house and die if I am not took. I can dig, Daniel, I can work, I can live hard, I can be loving and patient now, more than you think, Daniel, if you'll only try me. I wouldn't touch the allowance, not if it was dying of want, Daniel Peggotty. But I'll go with you and Emily if you'll only let me to the world's end. I know how it is. I know you think that I am lone and lorn, but dearie love, 'tan't so no more. I ain't sat here so long a-watching and a-thinking of your trials without some good being done me. Master Davy, speak to him for me. I knows his ways and Emily's, and I knows their sorrows and can be a comfort to 'em some odd times and labour for 'em always. Daniel, dearie Daniel, let me go along with you."
And Mrs. Gummidge took his hand and kissed it with a homely pathos and affection, in a homely rapture of devotion and gratitude that he well deserved. We brought the locker out, extinguished the candle, fastened the door on the outside, and left the old boat close shut up, a dark speck in the cloudy night. Next day, when we were returning to London, outside the coach, Mrs. Gummidge and her basket were on the seat behind, and Mrs. Gummidge was happy. Thank you all so much for joining me. More tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific, live at Fireside Reading on Instagram. It's a big day for Fireside Reading. It's the release of our first professional Fireside Reading of The Wizard of Oz. Please check it out if you would like. Or you can go to the Fireside Reading YouTube channel and check out any of the books we've read together. They're all there. And you can subscribe and comment and like if you would like. I certainly like it when I get those comments. Until I see you all tomorrow, please stay very well. Good night.